Welcome to the Agents of Innovation podcast, where we feature conversations with entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and artists. Well, welcome back to the Agents of Innovation podcast. I'm your host, Francisco Gonzalez. We have a wonderful guest today. Today's guest has spent his career in one of the few places left in American life where the rules still matter, where you can't win an argument simply by saying it louder, where accusations have to be tested and facts have to be separated from feelings. And that's Judge Roy Altman. He's a United States District Judge for the Southern District of Florida, right here in Miami, where I'm also situated now. And he was appointed at the youngest age in his district's history. A Yale Law graduate, former federal prosecutor, former appellate clerk. But something changed for him on October 7th, 2023. And what followed was 2 years of travel across 50 college campuses, listening to how people talk about Israel and noticing that most of them, including very educated people, simply don't have the tools to assess whether a claim is true. So he did what judges do. He applied the courtroom methodology, centuries tested, built for exactly this, to the most charged geopolitical debate of our time. And the result is his brand new book out this week, Israel on Trial. 6 of the most pervasive claims about Israel put to the evidentiary standard, not a political verdict, a legal one. Judge Altman, welcome to the Agents of Innovation podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, I was really thrilled to get a preview copy of your book. It is absolutely fantastic. And I've read a lot about Israel. I love Israel. I've been there once in 2018. And of course, I get a little frustrated listening, especially once you've been there, but also listening to some of the punditry and things that go on. And even just, like you said, kind of like the way your book puts it, very well-educated people, but not really grounded in the ability to make the assessments. And also, by the way, there's things that I don't know. I mean, I've been there. I've studied a lot of Israel. I've read a lot of books, but I think the way you put your books, the way your book has put a lot of the commentary, the way you framed it, so it gives people, I think, a very honest, transparent way to kind of become part of the jury, if you will, themselves. And so you're a sitting federal judge. You're not a journalist. You're not a political commentator. What made you decide to take what you do in a courtroom and apply it to arguably the most charged geopolitical debate of our time?
Well, I should say I didn't write the book as a judge. I wrote it as an American who cares deeply about the truth and the rule of law and the future of our country, which to my mind is intimately connected with our ability, especially the ability of our younger people, to be able to discern truth from falsehood. And what we find, and a lot of data has shown this, I mean, this won't be a surprise to anyone, that human beings are actually quite bad, especially on social media and on the internet, at discerning what's true from what isn't. On the other hand, when they come into the courtroom, they're not transformed biologically or psychologically, but when they come into the courtroom and they sit as jurors in the jury box, whether you're a lawyer or a juror yourself, and by the way, I just had a jury trial where one of the jurors was so moved by the experience. She's in healthcare. She wrote me the next Monday and said she's decided to go to law school at 39 years old. And one of the other jurors wrote separately to say that she wants her daughter to intern for me over the summer because she wants her to be inspired about the future of America, which is what I preach in the courtroom every day. But the point is, when they come in and sit in the jury box, they're not changed biologically. They're not made smarter or dumber. They're not changed psychologically. But they are given a set of tools, a toolbox, kind of methodology to use your reason and common sense to difficult, complex, and contested issues. And what we find in the courtroom is, unlike on the internet, jurors get it right almost all the time. How does that happen? If they're not being changed biologically, psychologically, they're not being made smarter, it's because we give them the tools that they need in order to discern truth from falsehood. And we've been doing that in this country long before the internet existed, for over 250 years now. And so what happened with this book is that after October 7th, I was just shocked by the things that I was hearing even smart people say on college campuses and Western media outlets, and of course at international organizations, And so I took it upon myself to, in all my free time, travel around the country, giving speeches about Israel, the Jewish people's history in the land of Israel, Israel under international law, and the great efforts it goes through to comply with international law norms, and in very difficult circumstances. And what I found in having really thousands of conversations, many of them with people who see the world very differently than I do, is that there really are 6 main claims about the state of Israel that pervade all the discourse. And actually, when you boil them down, each of those claims is actually a legal claim that requires legal analysis and legal assessments, much as all other legal claims do. And so I thought, why not just apply that same methodology, that same toolbox that we use to ensure that jurors get things right in the courtroom? It's a methodology that's been tested over 250 years in this country. And it's a methodology we know we trust because we use it where truth-telling matters the most in the courtroom, where someone's life is at stake, and apply it to these 6 claims and see what happens. And so each chapter gets a claim. There's 6 chapters, 6 claims. And that's why the book is called Israel on Trial.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So, you describe, as you just mentioned, jury instructions as essentially truth guides, right? A methodology that lets ordinary people cut through the noise and reach the right answer. By the way, I was kind of in one of those pre-jury selection pools last year up in Palm Beach County, actually, at the time. And you know what? I will say it was such an education. I was there actually all day, and I ultimately didn't get selected. And you go and you get the when you get the thing in the mail that says you've been selected. No, there's not a person in the world for the most part that's happy about that. It's like it's disruptive to your life, and you got to plan this, and you got to take days off, and you're not really getting paid. And so, but I will say I sat there the whole day, and I was like, actually, like I kind of want to be selected because, first of all, also the judge told us the trial would last no more than 2 days. I said, great, I can do 2 days. And I can't, and it's funny, I left there and I told people afterwards, even just the whole day after getting the judge's instructions, I said, that was more educational than anything I learned in high school or college, just sitting there the whole day and listening. And even between the lawyers and what they explained to us and everything on both sides of, they told us what the case was and what our response was. So it was super cool. So going back to those, judge's instructions. Can you walk us through what that playbook looks like when you apply it to, let's just say there was a very controversial news story that came out within minutes. Everybody, I think the New York Times read it on the front page, claiming that there was a hospital bombing that in Gaza that was supposedly done by the Israelis in October 2023. This is post October 7th. Can you tell us what like that jury playbook might look like? What would we need to do to assess a situation like that?
This is a really important example because even now I go to college campuses and students, when I tell them that Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza is the furthest thing definitionally and in practice from a real genocide in the context of urban warfare that we have ever seen. They say, well, what about the hospital bombing where 500 Palestinians were killed? They still believe it, which shows you how important and also how difficult this thing is, because it's now clear beyond peradventure. No one who knows anything about the subject believes anything other than the truth at this point, which is that Israel had nothing to do with it. And yet the damage has already been done because the news media and a lot of independent social media types propagated this Hamas claim, which came out right after, and didn't check the methodology that they were using, and ended up perpetuating a complete false claim about what happened. So what happens is that this is a few days after the October 7th attack. So there are no Israelis inside of Gaza, okay? Israel, as you may recall, did not invade Gaza until about 3 weeks after October 7th. I think the date was October 29th or something like that. This is about 10 or 12 days before any Israeli entered Gaza. There was a claim that an Israeli bomb, was dropped on the Al Aliyah hospital in Gaza, and that the hospital was completely obliterated, and 500 Palestinian civilians were inside and were instantly killed. And this went all over the New York Times. It went all over CNN. It was seen all over the world. And because of that, the repercussions were enormous. First of all, many of the Arab states saw enormous protests, violent riots in front of the U.S. embassies in those countries. President Biden, as you may recall, made a historic visit to Israel in the days after that, and many Arab leaders refused to meet him and work with him in the wake of those news stories, believing that Israel had dropped this bomb. And as I mentioned, even today, there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people all over the world, and especially here in America, who believe that Israel dropped this bomb on the hospital. In fact, we now know that Israel had absolutely nothing to do with it. What happened was that Hamas's claim, we now know, is fiction in almost every salient respect. It's fiction first in the fact that Israel did not drop a bomb. The fire resulted from a missile fired by Palestinian militants from Gaza that misfired and landed back indiscriminately in Gaza. By the way, we now know that over 20,000 missiles and rockets were fired from Gaza during the course of the war, and something like 20 to 25% of them misfire and fall indiscriminately back into Gaza. Why is that important? We will never know how many of the tens of thousands of people who were killed in Gaza were killed by Gazans, by Gazan rockets, by thousands of Gazan rockets fired towards Israel, which don't have precision-guided munitions, which aren't being guided by an elite Israeli fighter pilot, which aren't being supervised by elite Israeli international law of war scholars and lawyers who are making sure that there's limited collateral damages. These rockets come up, they burn up, they land on the ground, and they kill thousands of Palestinians. We will never know how many Palestinians died as a result of that. So first, Israel had nothing to do with the bomb. It was a Palestinian rocket that misfired and fell into Gaza. Second, it never hit the hospital. It hit the parking lot adjacent to the hospital where a bunch of beds had been set up. And the people didn't die from an explosion. They died from the fire that spread as a result of the rocket having just taken off and having a nearly full gas tank. And third, nowhere near 500 people died. We see this all the time with Hamas. Note this, when we were in Mosul in, I think, 2012, or maybe it was 2016, we still don't know exactly how many civilians died in the American assault in Mosul to destroy ISIS. And that's now 10 years later. When an Israeli bomb lands in Gaza, Hamas gives us the exact number within just a few seconds. 427, 238. Obviously impossible. So Hamas issues a press release that says 500 people are dead. We now know that fewer than 100 people died in the fire in the parking lot. So how should this have been adjudicated? The first thing is, in the courtroom, whether you're a lawyer or a juror, you are always looking for the witness's incentive structure, okay? If an expert witness takes the stand for the plaintiff and he says everything the plaintiff wants him to say in the case, well, the defendant is going to get up on cross-examine and say, sir, you have been paid $1 million for this testimony. And then you look over at the jurors, and the jurors are all like, you see it come over their eyes, a sense of clarity. Now I know why he's saying all that. Same thing with a criminal case. Witness comes on the stand and paints a fully perfect picture about the defendant's culpability in the case. The defense lawyer gets up and cross-examines and points out that the government gave him immunity. He's never going to prison for his involvement in this and many other crimes. And maybe even that his wife, who's an illegal immigrant, is going to get a visa so she can stay and is not going to be allowed to prosecute. Is not going to be prosecuted. And then you look over at the jurors, and again, clarity comes over their eyes. People's incentive structures are important. So why is Hamas believed when we know, when it tells us, when we have the history showing that Hamas purposefully lies? Because as Yahya Sinwar made clear in his private correspondence, which in the law, private correspondence gets special credibility attention, because we care what you said in private when you thought that nobody would be listening. Yahya Sinwar has admitted the whole strategy of Hamas is to drive up Palestinian civilian casualties or supposed Palestinian civilian casualties in order to get campuses flaring and Western media outlets aflame so that America and the West will get Israel to stop its war so that Hamas can survive another day to kill more Israelis and destroy the Jewish state. So why don't we consider that incentive structure when Hamas makes an instant and preposterous claim, just as we would with a cooperating defendant in a criminal case? Second, we look for objective evidence, not what one party says or what the other party says, not what the plaintiff says or what the defendant says, but we look for evidence that cannot be tampered with. Geo-timestamped video or photos, cell site data, things people said in private when they thought that nobody was listening. Here, all the objective evidence shows that this was a Palestinian rocket that fell indiscriminately back into Gaza. We have footage from 4 different cameras, 2 in Gaza and 2 in Israel. So you can't say they're all in Israel and they were tampered with by the Mossad. 2 of these cameras, we now know geolocated, were in Gaza, that at the moment, I think it was 6:29 or 6:30 in the morning of the rocket attack, showed the rocket leaving from Gaza, not from Israel, going up in the sky, burning up, and falling back into the area where the hospital is. Why is that important? Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, this was at a time before Israel invaded, when there were no Israelis in Gaza, where any rocket fired from Gaza necessarily was fired by Palestinians. Then, third, we look for things people said in private, as I mentioned, when we thought nobody was listening. There is a wiretapped conversation that has been made public, a wiretapped conversation between 2 Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives known. We know their names, their serial numbers, we have their ID cards. In that call, they admit that the rocket was fired by Palestinians in Gaza, that it was shrapnel from Gaza and not from the Israeli side. That is a quote from that wiretap conversation. Again, no Israeli, of course, in public or private, has ever admitted responsibility for this. And then we care about what experts say, right? We take claims, third-party claims, and we see, what do the experts say? Well, first of all, we have a third party, the United States, and its intelligence service with its own cameras and its own systems, satellite systems, that were reviewing the area at the time of the blast, which confirmed the Israeli claim that this was a Palestinian rocket that misfired from Gaza and landed near the hospital. No intelligence service of any Western country in the world has ever supported Hamas's claim. Next, we have the Wall Street Journal, which conducted an independent and geolocated timeline of the events, taking all the different pieces of evidence together, showing and confirming again the Israeli claim that this was a Palestinian rocket that fell indiscriminately back into Gaza. No such third party has ever provided a credible narrative supporting Hamas's claim. And then lastly, and most importantly, in terms of experts, we have this issue of spoliation of evidence, okay? When a party in the courtroom refuses to produce evidence, say the defendant asks the plaintiff's lawyer, okay, you say you were injured? Well, show us photographs of your injuries. Give us a doctor who can give us medical records reflecting that you had a surgery or a broken bone or whatever it is. If you as the plaintiff either refuse to provide it, or you what we call spoliate it, which is you destroy it from your laptop so that no such thing can ever be recovered, oftentimes the judge will give the jurors an instruction directing them to find that the person didn't just lose or destroy the evidence by mistake, wasn't just an accident, that they should find that they did so because they had something to hide, because they knew the evidence was destroyed, that evidence would hurt rather than help their case. That's what we call a spoliation instruction. In this case, the New York Times and a number of other outlets went to Hamas and said, well, this is simple. There was a big bomb. You said that there was an Israeli warplane that dropped this bomb. Give us the shrapnel from the crime scene, from the crater, the bombing crater, and show us the shrapnel so that we can take it to a lab, get it tested, and prove your claim that, in fact, it was Israel. Hamas mysteriously claimed that there were 0 pieces, the first bomb in history where there were 0 pieces of shrapnel anywhere that could be located. They all spontaneously combusted contrary to the laws of physics. Well, to its credit, the New York Times, at this point, having retracted its original story, went to munitions experts all over the world, including in Australia, who have no stake in this action, who said that's a preposterous claim. That cannot be believed. Obviously, every explosion leaves traces and shrapnel and bombing material. Hamas was in control of the crime scene. Hamas, if it really purported to believe its own story, should have produced that shrapnel to prove that Israel's materials were found in the bombing site. The last thing I'll say is there's been drone footage of that area where the bombing supposedly happened ad nauseum over the course of many days and weeks after the fact. And guess what it doesn't show? It doesn't show the kind of crater that you would expect from a huge Israeli bomb. We've seen these craters in Iran. We've seen them in Lebanon. These are telltale signs of an F-15 or F-35 plane dropping a bomb. That crater doesn't exist by the hospital. All the drone footage showed, because there was no warplane, there was no Israeli bomb. It was a misfired rocket that fell near the hospital, and people need the tools to be able to discern truth from falsehood.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think the way, again, you've outlined this, like a case, as your book says, and so I think it's, really a great way to do that. But I think that takes a little bit of time, right? It takes some discernment, and we live in this fast-paced culture where somebody puts something on the internet. Maybe it's even the New York Times. Maybe it's a reporter running with somebody's press release, and they go right to the internet, and then all of a sudden influencers and all sorts of other people tweet these things out, and the story just gets legs to where months yet later, maybe even years later, people are still repeating what was that false claim story. So it's really interesting the way. To that point, in this fast-paced environment versus what maybe a jury gets outside of the whole, media environment that we live in, and the constant social media environment, how can that courtroom methodology sort of counter the current media environment when it doesn't get maybe as many eyeballs or attention?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things to say. The first thing is, Israel gets criticized by Israelis all the time for not being quick enough to rebut these stories, okay? And they lose the media narrative for this reason. I actually respect them a great deal for it. By the way, the United States has that same problem in our wars. What happens is the enemy, Hamas, they don't care about the truth, right? The Iranians, they'll say whatever to float their side of the narrative. Right away, millions of people start reading it. They get incensed. They believe it. And Israel and the United States then do this thing where they say, well, we're a Western truth-seeking democracy. We're going to fact-check this stuff. So we don't have an answer for you yet, media. And they go back and they look at the logs and they see, hey, no plane was in the area. By the way, that's really important, right? Every square inch of that sky is being monitored by the Israeli Air Force. They can say with absolute certainty, we didn't have a plane in that area at that time, so this is impossible. Well, that takes time. It takes time to recreate the timeline. It takes time to go find the geolocated videos. And so they do lose some of that narrative. One of the things that I'm advocating for and have been going around the country talking about is that everyday citizens who understandably are getting information in real time and are trying to process it, they need to apply some of the common sense that they use in the courtroom when they're looking at information in the internet. What are a couple of things that people can do? The first is scrutinizing incentives, okay? Who is providing us with this information? I just gave you examples from the courtroom. An expert who's paid by a party, a cooperating witness who's received a tremendous benefit from the government. Who's providing all of the TikTok feeds that you're seeing, which I think to the tune of 20-1 are pro-Hamas and anti-Israel, an astonishing number. Who's providing that? Well, we know that it's our biggest geostrategic enemy, the Chinese. The Chinese government, which until recently owned TikTok, is providing that information. What about Al Jazeera, a geostrategic enemy of Israel, is providing that information? Why is that important? Well, think about it. If you were in charge of geostrategy at the Chinese Communist Party, and you looked around at your side of the 50-yard line. I played football, so I like this analogy. You looked at your side of the 50-yard line. You see you got the Russians on one side. You're like, I don't know about them. They really struggled against a much smaller and at least at the beginning of the war believed to be weaker enemy in Ukraine. I don't know that they can be trusted. You look at Iran, look, all of its missiles and Navy and its Air Force have been decimated by a tiny little country, Israel. By the way, I usually ask people who don't know anything about the subject, is Israel bigger, smaller, or the same size as California? Something like 90% of people will tell me it's either the same size or bigger than California. It's like 50 Israels could fit in California, something like that. It's like the size of New Jersey. It's such a tiny country that, as Yochai Sponder, a great comedian, once said, it's the only country where the name of the country doesn't fit in the country in a map. It has to appear Israel over the Mediterranean with an arrow pointing to the country. And that tiny little country has decimated Iran's military capacities and did so back in 2025 and again now in 2026. So the Chinese are looking around. They're like, well, we can't really trust them so much. Who's on the other side of the 50-yard line, right? We got America. That's a big bad enemy, right? That's tough. That we're going to have a lot of trouble dealing with them. So let's make sure that they're alone. And when they look around, they don't think to themselves, hey, we got to be afraid of the Belgians. We got to be afraid of the Dutch. Like that's a real scary navy that we're going to have to contend with, or the Swedes or the Icelanders. No, they look around and they say, who are the two places that have been fighting and dying for the future of Western civilization and have been winning the wars of the 21st century, Israel and Ukraine? So is it any surprise that the vast majority of false claims and divisive narratives that you see on social media are about, big surprise, those two countries, Israel and Ukraine? Our geostrategic enemies in the United States are desperately trying every which way to peel from the United States our most important fighting allies so that in the war that's coming, we will be left all alone. Look what happened in Iran. Only Israel was willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with us. Everybody else left us high and dry. And then the second thing is, putting aside incentives for a moment, putting that aside, let's try to scrutinize when we get a piece of evidence whether there is objective third-party proof for the claim that one side is making versus another. If you can't scrutinize their incentives and you don't have objective third-party proof, you should put it to one side for the time being.
So that's great. So I think your book and what you just outlined there is a great way for when myself or anybody else here listening sees some claim being made, could be about Israel or something else, right? Put it to this test. And I like your emphasis on the third-party verification in a sense, as well as what kind of evidence is there before kind of coming to an assumption about something, and maybe that can kind of quell our tensions at least a little bit, make us be a little more thoughtful rather than rushing to judgment. I think even nowadays too. I mean, I think in recent months have to pause and say, is this AI? Like, what's going on, right? There's so many reasons for us now to give that pause before we make an assumption. Just because you read it on the web doesn't mean it's true, and that stuff has fire, takes off. Well, speaking of federal judges, as yourself, you've been leading trips of federal judges from across the political spectrum, I guess, if people assess it that way, to Israel since October 7th. So what happens when a judge who's never been to Israel and maybe has no stake in either side of the conflict applies this methodology after seeing it firsthand?
Well, the trips are amazing, and we've been on several trips and have taken now a significant number of judges, Jewish and mostly non-Jewish. Mostly you've never been to Israel before, and as you say, appointed by both parties, because the issue, to my mind, is not political. The issue is about the future of America. Do we stand by our most important geostrategic ally? Do we care about the truth? Do we care about democracy, religious pluralism, tolerance of other? Do we care, in my view, about the rule of law? And the judges that I've been taking to Israel, I've been so amazed by them, and I've been so proud of my association with them. These people, they love the country. They've dedicated their entire lives to serving their communities and the future of America. They've dedicated their entire livelihood. These people could have made so much more money at private firms, and they're making whatever we make, 250 grand a year, which is, of course, good money, but not the millions of dollars that private lawyers sometimes make. And they do it because they love the country, because they care about the future of America. And they go to Israel and they see a country that is intimately entwined with the project and the experiment that we here in America set out to embark on 250 years ago. And by the way, that's been true for hundreds of years in America, that our greatest leaders have seen our project as intimately entwined with the Jewish story. Abraham Lincoln called America the almost chosen people. That is not words that man used by accident, okay? He was very careful with his terminology. He had always viewed the Jewish people, the Jewish story, as underpinning the American story based on its idealism about the rule of law, about pluralism, and most importantly of all, about the Judeo-Christian tradition that, to his mind, was the foundation stone of this country. That was true also of George Washington in his letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and certainly Mark Twain, who himself visited Israel and wrote about it in Innocents Abroad. So to me, going to Israel and seeing Israel through the eyes of our non-Jewish judges from every Christian denomination has been really quite a treat. And I'll just tell a quick story. You know, we went over Ash Wednesday the last time, and I didn't have an Ash Wednesday service for them. And I felt quite anxious. Anxiety is not really my hallmark, but I was anxious because I didn't want them to feel like I had brought them to Israel and they had come in the middle of a war and I didn't have the decency to find them an Ash Wednesday service. By the way, now on the internet, we see this claim, ridiculous claim, that Israel and Jews, they don't care about Christians. There's no country in the world that has devoted more of its time and its energy and its money to preserving ancient Christian holy sites. In fact, anyone who has been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre knows that Israel has delegated authority over that church to 6 Christian denominations who manage it fully, fairly, and freely in the Jewish state of Israel. And that's true, of course, of other places like the Garden of Gethsemane, the entire Via Dolorosa, everything in the Sea of Galilee, including Magdala and Nazareth and the Mount of the Beatitudes. Anyway, so we went up, the judges, to the Syrian border, to Majd al-Shams, a Druze, Arab Druze community. I don't know if your listeners know about the Arab Druze, but the Druze are an Arab people who lived in the Levant, the area between Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, for thousands of years. And they converted from Islam about 1,000 years ago to this new religion, this Druze religion. And they've been persecuted by the Arab Muslim majorities for many, many years, or continue to be violently suppressed in Syria. And they live as free and equal citizens of the Jewish state of Israel. And what happened at Majd al-Shams, which will go down in the annals of Jewish history, is that in the summer of 2024, a Hezbollah rocket from Lebanon struck a soccer field, beautiful soccer field, by the way, built in the center of Majd al-Shams, this rugged mountain Druze community by the Israeli government. That soccer field was struck by a Hezbollah rocket that killed 12 beautiful Druze children, boys and girls, who were playing on that soccer field. And I'll have you remember, and history will remember, that the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon to kill Hassan Nasrallah, to decapitate the Radwan forces leadership, and to destroy with pagers and walkie-talkies and all the rest that you all know about in the summer and early fall of 2024 was precipitated not by the killing of a single Jew, but by the deaths of 12 Arab Druze children. That was the explicit precipitating event for the invasion. I tell people on college campuses all the time, you call this an apartheid state, you can tell a lot about a country by who it is willing to fight and in the case of Israel's soldiers, die for. And in this case, Israel went to war and fought and died for its Arab, Druze, minority citizens. We should never forget that. Anyway, we had a very moving ceremony with the families of the children who were killed on that soccer field, actually on the soccer field, which was still charred black by the rocket. The bicycles, the little kids' bicycles, were all mangled and torn near the soccer field. And after the ceremony with the families, we got back into the bus, and I was even more anxious because now it's the afternoon, and I still didn't have an Ash Wednesday plan. And these Israel trips, the Israelis are always yelling at you, yada, yada, we're an hour behind because you're packing 1,000 things into one day. But this day, the Israelis came to me and they said, Judge, I don't know how, but we have an extra hour on the calendar to spare. This is our first miracle, by the way. And so I said, well, let's see where we're going now. And we were leaving the Golan, which is on the northeastern side of Israel. And we were going to Caesarea, which is in the western coast. And so what do you have to cross? When you go from the Golan to Caesarea, you have to cross the Sea of Galilee. So I thought to myself, well, they must have a church on the Sea of Galilee somewhere, So I pulled out my iPhone and I literally typed in very sophisticated search. For your tech listeners, they'll know I'm very sophisticated tech-wise. I wrote Church Sea of Galilee, very sophisticated. And would you believe it, like 20 or 30 popped up. And all I did was I called the first one, the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter, an amazing church. And the pastor answered the phone. And I told him, I said, hey, do you have time to do a Ash Wednesday service for 25 federal judges from America? And he said, praise Jesus. And I said, well, why praise Jesus? And he said, well, you're not going to believe this, Judge, but just a few minutes ago, my supervising priest had come to me and said, hey, look, it's the afternoon. Everybody who's had an Ash Wednesday service, wanted one, has had one. So you can go home. And he said to me, but I had a premonition that I should stay for 15 or 20 more minutes. And then a few minutes after that, you called with 25 federal judges who desperately needed an Ash Wednesday service. So I said, praise Jesus, And so all our judges laughed. We go to the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter, and this is no ordinary church, okay? When I tell you that this church is on the Sea of Galilee, I don't want you to misunderstand. The church, the outer walls of the church are so close to the Sea of Galilee that sometimes when the tide is high, they come right up onto the edge of the stones of the church. And the church sits between the Sea of Galilee on one side and the Mount of the Beatitudes on the other, where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. And so when we got to the church, we went into the church and we realized that the church had been built around a giant stone. I mean, this stone takes up maybe a third of the church, just the way that like Odysseus's home was built around that tree that he built his bed out of. So too with this church. And this stone, it's maybe 13 or 14 feet long, maybe 7 or 8 feet wide. It's the stone where the Gospels tell us Jesus had bread and fish with the 7 of the disciples after he was resurrected, right on that stone. And so many of the judges wanted to go and touch and kiss the stone, and the priest comes up to me. He goes, Judge, get the judges off the stone, And I was like, Father, nobody's touched this stone in 2,000 years. Let the judges kiss the stone, And then we had the most moving, the most transformative, the most inspiring to me and to our judges Ash Wednesday service any of them, and certainly I, had ever participated in. None of them will ever forget it. And what I think was most special about it, and what I hear from the judges when we talk about it is, a lot of the judges came to Israel to support their Jewish friends and neighbors because they thought of it as their heritage, their ancient homeland. But they left Israel recognizing that that was their ancient homeland, their heritage, their spiritual, national, and religious home as well. Because, of course, the Judeo-Christian family comes from one place, one land, one city, and that's the holy city of David in the Jewish land of Israel, a kingdom that has existed in its Jewish sovereignty for thousands of years in that land and continues to do so today.
Wow, what a story! Yeah, I agree with you too. And someone who's Catholic, I mean, it was just as moving for me to be there to see all the places some of the places you mentioned where Jesus walked, preached, taught, and actually, I think it's funny. I don't think I was at that particular church of Saint Peter that you mentioned. Jesus
I
also.
know you're planning a trip to go back. You have to go back. It's an amazing place.
Yeah, I've been to Capernaum and saw Peter's home, so I don't think that's the site of the church, but I know there's a church on top of the home. Um, but it's interesting that there's this stone there because Jesus literally told Peter, "You're the rock, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church." So I'm sure there's some significance behind that stone
Absolutely.
as well. No, I think it's incredible. And yes, what's also interesting is I actually went to Israel in 2018, led by a Christian group, and the entire time our guide was an Israeli Jew. And I remember somewhere halfway through the trip, somebody in the bus turned to me and said, "Did you know that Yoav is Jewish?" Because he was talking about Jesus the whole time. Everywhere Jesus, here's another place where Jesus was, and I said, "Yeah, I pretty much assumed he was Jewish because he's from Israel, and I could even tell a little bit of his accent and things like that." But I think they were just surprised at how much an Israeli Jew who lives there and as a tour guide, and this is what they do. And I said, "Look, Jesus, you don't have to believe is the Messiah. Christians do, but I mean, he was a historical figure, and if you're going to have any tour guide of any kind, I mean, he's going to tell you the exact spots that are important to where Jesus actually was." And I think, the Israel tourism department, whatever you want to call it, it's a real rigorous. I mean, for people to be like official guides in Israel for any of these sites, it's a real rigorous process. And by the way, Yoav was so good, and I've kept in touch with him. We hosted him for an event in Orlando a couple years ago, and actually, he's the one that's going to be leading our group trip when Fearless Journeys finally makes it there.
Amazing.
So we've been in lots of conversations. I was just watching a Facebook Live of him yesterday, giving an update from Israel. So it's also been very informative on what's going on over there, the on the ground. Everything, but speaking of some of the false claims, or maybe claims that I don't know are false.
What about all the anti-Christian discrimination that you experienced in Israel when you were there? Are you saying there was no such thing? That's just a completely false claim?
Definitely no such thing. I mean, no experience here, and in fact, I met a lot of Muslims as well that live in Israel that actually I think expressed their preference to live where they live rather than in some of the other places across the border, because they feel more free there. I mean, even Yoav was telling me his barber, is an Arab Muslim, and they live in the same neighborhood basically. So I think there's a lot of false, terms when you talk about these claims of apartheid. Definitely a lot of false narratives on that front. But even recently, so again, I don't even know what's 100% true in this recent claim. I imagine there's some truth somewhere in here, but a lot of people were getting upset online in the last couple of weeks during the Easter season. I believe it was on Palm Sunday that one of the cardinals of the church, the Catholic Church, was actually denied access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to do a Palm Sunday. And so there was also... So one, I don't even know. It seemed like that was true. There was some level of denied access, but also on the other end, there was a lot of people saying, and yet the Jews have had access to all of their holy sites. So yes, can you maybe legally parse this out?
Point. And by the way, I'll be the first to tell you, and I tried to work to rectify it, and it was rectified. The first thing to note is that there was an order that came out when the war started. This is typical, by the way, when these wars start, that you wouldn't have gatherings of more than 50 people anywhere, not just at religious sites, but you couldn't go to a nightclub, you couldn't go to a bar, you couldn't go to a restaurant. School was closed, So, and that's because, of course, one of these missile hits, and we don't want it killing 500 people. So that rule applied both to holy sites and non-holy sites. But it certainly applied to all holy sites, which included both Christian, Muslim, and Jewish sites. And in fact, one thing that a lot of rabbis have in their synagogues is a 24/7 feed of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the ultimate Jewish holy site. And and I had been in one of my rabbi's offices, just happened to be when all of this was going on, and the feed was up on his TV. And guess what? It was completely empty, not a human being in sight, because the rule applied equally to Christian, Muslim, and Jewish holy sites. But here's the thing. The government of Israel was not the one that denied the cardinal from going into the church. It was the local police who had an order. And we know how bureaucracies work, especially with police departments. They got an order. They don't know why the order was made. They don't know who gave the order. And they heard the cardinal wanted to go there, or whoever it was, and they said, you can't come in. When the firestorm started, the issue was brought to the attention of the government, and the government said, wait, you want to have less than 50 people there? Then it's perfectly acceptable. And they reversed the denial and allowed the cardinal to have his mass in the church. So first thing to note is that it applied equally to everyone, not just to religious sites. Second thing is it applied equally to all religious sites, not just Christian ones. And third, the order was quickly reversed when it became clear that the cardinal didn't want to have more than 50 people there, and that he wanted to have fewer than 50 to have a private mass. The last thing I'll say is, whether in Israel or in the United States, sometimes governmental bureaucracy does get in the way, and we should never overestimate that reality.
That's a great segue to my next question, because you distinguish in the book, I believe, a little bit between criticizing Israeli government policy and anti-Zionism. Like, where do you draw that line, and how does your legal framework help to clarify it?
Yeah, so we're Americans, right? It's a national pastime to play baseball and criticize our government. We enshrine that right in our First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, to criticize the government, to say when the government is wrong, and to throw them out of office. By the way, nobody loves doing that more than the Israelis. There's an old joke that if you've got two Jews stranded on a desert island, when they get rescued years later, they'll have 3 synagogues. And the people say, well, why 3 synagogues? Well, the guy says, well, one for me, one for him, and the synagogue we will never get caught dead in, And that's because Jews debate, they disagree. That's the Judeo-Christian tradition that forms the foundation stone of our common law legal tradition here in the West, and especially in America. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand, is that we criticize our government. Israelis criticize their government. By the way, I criticize the Israeli government all the time when it does things that I don't like. It's one thing to say, well, I criticize the government, but when I do that, when I criticize the American government or the South African government or whatever government, I'm not suggesting that the entire American political experiment was an evil mistake, and that the country should be destroyed and forgotten in the dustbin of history, and all of its 350 million citizens should either be exiled or exterminated, right? Nobody is saying, okay, this or that administration did this road or labor union deal badly, or prosecuted this war incorrectly, and so let's kill all 350 million Americans and destroy the entire political project. But that is exactly what the anti-Zionists are saying, right? When you are an anti-Zionist, what that means is that you are rejecting the principal Zionist proposition, which is not that Jews are better than anybody else, but that Jews are equal to everyone else. And so if you're going to have nation states that are ethno-national states, which was very common in the 20th century, we're going to have a Bulgarian state for Bulgarians, and we're going to have an Irish state for Irishmen, and we're going to have a Greek state for Greeks. And later we're going to have a Syrian state for Syrians, and an Iraqi state for Iraqis, and a Japanese state for Japanese people. Well, we should be allowed to have a Jewish state for Jewish people too. And if you're an anti-Zionist that believes that Jews don't have the same rights as other people to have their own state in their own ancestral homeland, then you're just an anti-Semite who treats Jews differently and worse, that's the definition of discrimination, than you treat all other people. And we shouldn't gloss that over. And the last thing I'll say is that there's a long history in the world of anti-Zionism, and my book actually details that long history. And since you read it, I think you know that it starts with an English journalist named J. Hobson in 1899. He's covering the Boer War in South Africa, and he comes to this, what he thinks is a brilliant eureka moment, where he says, I see all colonialism in the world is funded by Jewish banks. Therefore, Jews are the ultimate imperialists. And Lenin in 1917, when he writes his Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, runs with that idea. He gives Hobson credit and basically says, yes, all imperial colonialism, by the way, let's ignore the fact that the Soviet Union was the biggest imperial colonialist entity, swallowing up all of its neighbors and imposing its political and social culture on them. Let's ignore that. Imperialism was all funded and created by Jews, Lenin says. And that then becomes the Soviet credo and ideology all through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And when the Jewish state is created, the Soviet Union has a brief pause where Stalin geostrategically believes it's in his political interest to support the creation of a Jewish state. By the way, Soviet Union very quickly tried to forget that. And then soon in the 1950s, it reverts back to this anti-Zionism and now treated Israel, the new Zionist project, since it was Jewish, as the heart of all colonialism in the world. And that view then affected the viewpoints of all the decolonized Soviet satellite states that began to spring up in the 60s and 70s all throughout the Arab world and in Africa. The point is that throughout that entire time, when you go back to old Soviet newspapers and Soviet radio shows and manifestos and pamphlets that talked about Jewish Zionism and anti-Zionism, they purposefully linked it to anti-Semitism because that was fashionable at the time. To be an anti-Semite in Soviet Russia was a good thing. And so anti-Zionism was a good philosophy precisely because it was understood to be anti-Semitic. Nowadays, of course, you have the anti-Zionists doing this weird philosophical dance where now that they see that anti-Semitism is suddenly unfashionable, they're trying to divorce anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. But that is a complete historical anachronism.
You know, it's interesting. You say it's not fashionable, but I feel like it's coming back into fashion. It's actually kind of alarming for me to see some of the things that people talk about right here on our soil in the United States, especially on college campuses. I mean, we saw this, I think maybe at Columbia University was just a great example of what we saw just in the last 2 years. How do you feel? And as someone who's also Jewish, and how do you feel about the rise of anti-Semitism? I mean, to me, it seems even more prevalent online with all these online communities. We can talk about different pundits and different activists out there and things like that on both the left and the right now. What is your sort of sentiment right now in terms of is with the rise of anti-Semitism and how it also relates to this anti-Zionism?
I'm less surprised by most people about what happens online because I was a federal prosecutor for 7 years, and I was a deputy chief in the section that did child pornography. And this is going to be an uncomfortable moment. So for your listeners, maybe some of them want to tune this out. But the reality is, even going back 10 years ago, and this was initially very shocking to me, that you would, FBI agents spend their entire days going into these chat rooms online where there are not 10 people, not dozens of people, not hundreds of people, where there are thousands of men, mostly men, who are trading in, laughing about, and masturbating to the most disgusting, violent, sadistic, masochistic child pornography you would never want to conceive of. Let's put it that way, okay? And so I was initially shocked, not just by the disgusting nature of the content, but also by the sheer number of people who are in their mom's basements or who knows what, trading in and enjoying this disgusting, horrific content. And I made it part of my life's work to say, I'm going to stand up for these victims here in the courtroom and give them some redress. By the way, I couldn't believe when federal prosecutors would get hired, this amazing privilege to represent the country, and they would come to me when I was deputy chief of this section, and they'd say, hey, Roy, I'd love to come into this section. You guys do such great work. You guys do all the violent crime and the gangs and the human trafficking. I just don't want to look at any of that child pornography. I don't want to handle any of those cases. And I'd say, you know what? You got no chance to come into my section. And you know why? because it was much worse for the kids who had to go through it. And if you, who got this job selected among hundreds of people who applied, aren't willing to stand up for them, who will? So I'm not that shocked that there are people trading in falsehoods and in disgusting conspiracy theories online. But here's why I am concerned, okay? Just as I was when I was a federal prosecutor. If you look throughout history, societies that allow Jews to flourish are societies that are healthy and that are thriving themselves. And there's no better example of that anywhere in human history than the United States of America, the place where the biggest and most prominent and wealthiest Jewish community that has ever existed has been created, founded, and thrived. But on the other hand, where societies start to turn against the Jews, we see in history time and again that those are societies that are sick and dying. Look at the Russia of Kishinev, one of the great pogroms in history before the Holocaust in 1903. 14 years later, it was gone. Look at the Germany of Kristallnacht in 1938. It was supposed to be the 1,000-year Reich. It was the most powerful army in the world, the most powerful economy in the world. 7 years later, it was dead. So not because I'm Jewish, but because I'm an American who came to this country as a young boy with my family, knowing no one and having nothing or very little, and who was given every blessing and privilege this country as the greatest force for good the world has ever known bestows on all its children, has been given all these privileges and amazing opportunities. I am concerned that the rot of Jew hatred, which is an infection that seeds itself in the moral wooden framework of our house, if we are not careful, then it will bring the entire edifice, that whole beautiful structure we've spent 250 years constructing, tumbling down on all of us, not just the Jews.
That's really well stated, and a lot to think about. Speaking of your own story, coming here from another country, I understand you were born in Caracas, Venezuela. When did you come here, and what was your experience like? And then a little bit more to the point of you said, I mean, really, you are a living embodiment of the American dream. I mean, a federal judge here in Miami. Tell us a little bit more about that side of your story coming here.
I came when I was a little boy. I was 2 or 3 years old, something like that. My mother had been held at gunpoint, I think maybe a second time in Caracas. And she said to my dad, "That's it. We're leaving, whether you like it or not." And they came to America. They came to Miami. And I'll tell you, my experience here has been everything that my family could have possibly dreamed of. For the first time in the many, many generations of my family, which had been pushed around in Europe, survived the Holocaust, moved to South America, came to a place where we could be home, where we could be embraced with open arms by our non-Jewish neighbors, where we didn't have to worry about safety or security. And I'll never forget, when I was a little boy, all of our family vacations were the same. We would go in our red Toyota Previa, for Venezuelan Jews, being stuffed into the Previa, and we would drive around the American South, and we'd go to all the Civil War battlefields. Been to all the battlefields that you know of, Gettysburg and Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, and all the ones you've never heard of. And one day we were at Chattanooga. And
Love Chattanooga.
You been there?
Oh, yeah. Actually, my mother was born there, but she came to Miami, or to Florida, I should say, when she was 2. I love Chattanooga.
So we were at Chattanooga, and it's a very special, hallowed place in American history because it's a turning point in the war. The war's not been going well, and the Union Army, 50 or 60,000 men, are at the foothill of Missionary Ridge. The Confederates are up on top, and it looks like it's going to be yet another battle that the Union will lose. And in fact, the Army had been given strict instructions not to charge up the hill because of the heavy casualties that would have ensued. And an interesting thing happened. It's amazing what one man can do to change the course of history. Douglas MacArthur, who would become famous as a general in World War II and in the Korean War, his father, Arthur MacArthur, an amazing name, who had lied about his age to get into the Army. I think he was 17. He saw the standard bearer holding the American flag in front of him get shot. The flag falls onto the ground, and he couldn't bear the thought of the flag being on the ground. So he picked up the flag, and he ran up the hill by himself. And the rest of the Army sees this kid running up the hill with the flag. They figure, I guess the orders changed. They charge up the hill behind him and take the hill. The Confederates flee, and the Battle of Chattanooga was won. And I think Mr. MacArthur became the youngest person ever to win the Medal of Honor. And there's a plaque about it at the top of Missionary Ridge there. And so my father and I were there. My sister and mother were already too tired back in the Previa. And my father and I were standing there, and it started to snow. I was 8 years old. And, I grew up in Miami, Venezuela, going to Israel over the summer. Not a lot of snow in my childhood. So that was the first time I saw snowflakes. And I turned to my dad overlooking the battlefield, and I said, "Papi, this is so beautiful. This is so fun." And he turned very sternly to me suddenly and said, "You think this is fun? Then you don't understand why we are bringing you to these places." And he said, "We brought you and bring you to these battlefields so that you understand the character of the nation we brought you to. We are in a country where hundreds of thousands of men gave their lives so that a part of the country could be free. That is the level of sacrifice that is asked of you to continue to live in a vibrant, free, and fair democracy. Never forget that." And I never have. And I'm trying desperately to impart that to my own children. And I'll say I'm mostly the way there. They were watching Top Gun Maverick the other day, which they've watched probably 600 times. And in the middle of the movie, my younger son, 6 years old, he turns to me and he goes, "Papa, America's awesome, isn't it?" And I said, "Huh? I have succeeded."
That's fantastic. No, that's a great story. And I think to your point, I mean, this is a way I think a lot of people should really go out and experience American history. I can visualize actually because I was right there near Point Lookout and all that when in Chattanooga when you were what you were describing, and actually it was kind of a little surprising to me too, because even when I was in that area for a little time in 2022, I spent like a month there actually in Chattanooga, and I went by and I visited these sites, and I actually kind of was surprised because I just, as much of a history person I am, I wasn't really thinking I was coming across a place of such a significant battle. So like you said, some of the places where we know, Gettysburg, and other places where maybe there was a little bit, but that was I think to your point as well, I mean, how one person could just change history like that. What an amazing story, almost providential, if you will. And I think that kind of, brings us back here. You've done an incredible job with this book. I think with everything we're living in the information age, and we have so much information coming at us. How can we really parse through it in a proper and ethical way, to also come to our own ideas and our own, opinions on things? And I think the way you've laid out how we should do that really goes back to the really maybe the best way that our founders laid that out. And that is in the court of the same system that's adjudicated in the court of law, and how we got to kind of take your emotion out of it a little bit and just look at the evidence and who's presenting the evidence and all these different ways. You have a sort of a 6-part process here of how people should look at things, and you also take on 6 different claims that people have that are about Israel, that sort of the anti-Zionists have about Israel that they're really furthering. So I think it's a great book. Everybody should pick it up. I'm sure, is it going to be available on Audible as well?
Audible as well. I'm doing the recording. It's a long and arduous process, but this voice will be on the recording.
Fantastic. Well, if people got through an hour podcast listening to this voice, I'm sure a few more hours on the Audible will be great. Judge Altman, just wanted to say thank you for being on the Agents of Innovation podcast, and thank you for being an agent of innovation. And again, your book is Israel on Trial, and it's out now, and people can find it in all the places they find books, including Amazon, right?
That's right. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, sir.